Welcome back to Practical Tactical Faith, where we show you simple and effective ways to investigate the truth and strategic ways to share them with your family and other people. So today, I just want to kind of welcome you into one of the ministries that we do. It's the fourth and fifth grade Sunday school. We call it Power Hour, but I refer to it as our Casemakers Academy. For a few years ago, I was given the opportunity to start teaching our fourth and fifth grade Sunday school classes. And one of the curriculums I knew I wanted to use was J. Warner Wallace's Casemakers Academy. If you don't know his story, it's amazing. He was 35 years old and had been an atheist. He wanted to, his wife was attending church, and so he kind of supported her going to church. He was never a big advocate for it. He thought he was the good guy. He's a police officer. He's actually a cold case homicide detective. And so in attending church with her, he wanted to know who this Jesus was. And he wanted to know if the accounts of the New Testament were true. And so he started to investigate the New Testament Gospels as almost like eyewitness accounts. And he could not come away from the realization that it really did seem like they were accurate and that they were true. And so ever since then, he's been a Christian and an apologist, as someone who is defending the faith. And he's written several adult books, and then Cold Case Christianity and Person of Interest. But he's turned the books that he's written as adults into children's versions. And so the children's books that we have are Cold Case Christianity is the first one. We do that for a year. And then God's Crime Scene is the second one, and we do that in the second year. And then Forensic Faith is the third book that kind of wraps everything up. We just finished the Forensic Faith book last year, and so we're back to our Cold Case Christianity, but we've got a new crop of kids, and so it's all new information to them. What I'm going to share with you is how I deliver the lessons from the book. And so maybe some of it would be helpful for you if you're wanting to implement this in your Sunday school or in your homeschool group. And so to see what might be helpful. So let me start with showing you. These are the books that are used. And when I create either kind of like handouts or material for the parents, this is usually what I show them, just so they kind of know what we're working with. And so let me go ahead and I'm going to show you a few things here. I'll always start, this is when you start, they have a website, it's called Casemakers Academy, and they've got great little videos. And also that's where you're going to find any of the downloadable sheets. It's really, he's done a great job with it. So what you'll want to do before the first class is go ahead and print out the documents. He's got kind of like cover pages that I use to make notebooks out of. And then they have their training sheets, which are fun little activity sheets. Those are great to kind of have out on the tables. Kids can start coloring them and participating with the activity. But then they also have note sheets that have blanks in them to help them kind of focus in on listening to the chapter. I have books for each of the children, but I also screen record the chapter and have it up just in case either I'm not available or that way I'm not just focused on reading. I can let that play and the children can answer the questions from the note sheet while they're reading along and listening along also. So let me show you a little bit about how we kind of do our process. So as we start the morning, getting everything queued up and ready, this is usually what I'll put on the whiteboard. I plug my laptop into the television and have that ready with a couple of the little videos I'm getting ready to show you. But I also go ahead and put this on our whiteboard. This is our agenda for the day. We always start with a blessing. We have a little snack for the children. And so this is a great way to say, you might have a blessing that you have already that your family says before you eat. If you don't, here's an example of a blessing you can do. And so today at lunch or dinner, you might want to say, hey, does anybody mind if I say the blessing? And then you can say this blessing, and we bless their little snack. Number 2 on the agenda is taking up tithe and offering. This is the time that I'll usually point out the lights being on, or the fact that we have internet going to the television, or that the room is a comfortable temperature, or that we have a missions ministry where if someone were to come in and say, I can't pay my rent, or I don't have enough food, or can anybody help me? I've lost my job. We have resources available to give them a gas card or a overnight stay at a hotel, and then get them plugged into other resources to help with any financial difficulties or homelessness that they're experiencing. And so I always ask them, where do we think that money comes from to be able to do that? And we get all kinds of interesting answers, but this is the time to share that money comes from the church family. It comes from their parents. It comes from us. And without voluntarily contributing to the church, we wouldn't be able to do those things. And so it's a time to kind of teach about that. We usually start out with the concept that tithe refers to kind of a 10%. And so this is the practical application of that. I like to point out to pretend, that they get $10 for an allowance or for a birthday or a holiday or something. And imagine if from this point on, that every time they got any money, that they would start out by taking 10% for giving, and then 20% for saving and putting that away for something they want to save for, 30% for something that they might want, and then 40% for needs, whatever it is that they might need. But imagine if they did that for every time they got money. They didn't just spend it on whatever, but they broke it down like that: 10% giving, 20% saving. And imagine if they carried that habit on into their adulthood, so that they would most likely be less likely to be in financial need and more likely to be equipped to help others. And so that's something that we kind of talk about, to see if they could start to apply those practices the next time that they got money. Number 3 on the agenda is our memory work, and you can see the memory work that we'll cover on the right-hand side. Number 4, we do just a kind of a introduction to the books, and the fact that they didn't realize it, but when they walked in, they are in a junior detective academy. I introduced them briefly to the characters of the book or the concepts of the book, and tell them a little bit about what we'll be doing. They all get notebooks, so I print out those pages, and I've already got them in their little notebook. Usually this first class, though, I don't have a ton of time to get into the actual components of the book, because the introduction to the memory work takes us just a little bit. But if I spend a little bit of time today on introducing the memory work, then the second class, we can breeze through memory work. It kind of becomes just a routine that we do. It gets it in their memory bank, and then we can focus more on the actual components of the Cold Case Christianity book. So at this point, I'm going to just share with you what I do to go over their memory work and how we do that. So you'll see the first thing is Old Testament, New Testament. We actually go over the books of the Bible. For some of my old kids, they've heard this, but it's been a summer, and so now we're kind of reminding them of it. I'll hold up their Bible and I'll say, this is the Word of God. It's been broken up into the Old Testament and the New Testament in different books. Each book is written sometimes by a different author or a different person who wrote it down, but it was inspired by God. And I'll also point out that this is a good way to think that each book might have a different way that it's writing. Some of it might be poetry or the law or narrative, like a newspaper report, like it's a history. And so each time we read something in the Bible, we want to think about who wrote this, who are they writing it to, kind of like a letter. When did they write it, and what's the message? What are they trying to convey? And so that we think about it every time we read something in the Bible. And so I'll ask the kids, what's the difference between the Old Testament and New Testament, and we'll try to get some version of the New Testament is where we see Jesus as a human. Jesus was not created. He has always been. That's an important distinction. But we say that this is where we see Jesus come into earth as a human. Whereas in the Old Testament, we don't see Jesus as a human just yet. And so let me go ahead and I'll show you the videos I use. These just come off of YouTube. I think they're pretty simple, but they have been really effective in getting the kids to memorize their memory verses. So here we go. Oh, I'm sorry.
Kansas, Texas, ability just numbers, Joshua judges Ruth, first and second Samuel, first Kings, second Kings, first and second Chronicles, Ezra, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Job, Psalm, John, Micah, Nehemiah, Habakkuk, Zechariah,
Perfect. So then next we'll go to our New Testament books. Usually I'll play that twice just for them to kind of hear it a repeated time. Well, then we'll do New Testament.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Romans, First and Second Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, First and Second Thessalonians, First and Second Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, Hebrews, and the Book of James, First and Second Peter, First and Second, Third John, Jude, and Revelation.
Perfect. And usually this first time, they are just kind of hearing it, but then after a time or two of hearing it, they start singing along with it. I'll also point out, I'll have them open up the Bibles that I've already got for them in their place and have them follow along with the table of contents. A lot of times seeing it on the screen, seeing it in the Bible, and hearing it along kind of in a catchy song is really helpful for them to start to memorize it. And we do this every week. They just kind of know that this is part of the beginning of the memory work. And by the end of it, they've memorized all the books of the Bible. So the next thing that we cover, you'll see in number 2, is I always ask them, what in the world is Gal 522? And it gives us the opportunity to say that this is an abbreviation for Galatians 5:22, the fruit of the Spirit. This is where I'll usually go ahead and introduce Saul of Tarsus and say that this book was written by the Apostle Paul, but I'll start to kind of tell the story about Saul of Tarsus. And I'll say, let me tell you about this guy. He was someone who was a Jewish scholar, and he very much was very proud of being Jewish. And when he found out that there were people who were trusting in and following Jesus, he did not like that at all. In fact, he would persecute those people, and he was awful to them. He might have put them in jail or had them killed. And so one day he was walking along as Saul of Tarsus, walking along the road to Damascus, which is a city in Syria. He's walking along this road, and all of a sudden, a bright light blinded him. And he was greeted by Jesus, who said, "You've got to stop persecuting these people. They are following me, and you need to follow me also." And from there, he was converted from his old, broken, fallen, wicked nature to a nature that was more like Jesus. And that's what we're looking, that's what is an essential part of Christianity. I think it's a common misconception that people will think as Christians, we either have kind of very legalistic ways of behaving, or that we have this rule book that we're going to follow just perfectly because we're told to. But they miss the part that says, This is not because we will ourselves to follow these rules perfectly. We can't do that on our own. That's not in our nature. We have this broken, fallen nature. I usually to use this time to kind of point out a key component about the nature of humans is that we are inherently fallen and broken. I'll say, a lot of times you might hear that people say, oh, humans are they're basically good and they're trying their best. And but I'll remind the children, I'll say, let me ask you a question. Do your parents, do they need to teach you to be bad, or do they need to teach you to be good? Did they ever have to teach you how to be selfish and want to take things from your brother and sister, or teach you how to talk back, or did they have to teach you how to be kind and patient and selfless? And they'll very quickly understand that they don't have to be taught how to be bad. They usually have to be taught how to be good. And because that's kind of our human nature. But what Paul is saying when he's writing to this church of Galatia, and that's kind of how we'll talk about what that word means, Galatians, is that when we get transformed by the Holy Spirit, it's not us just following the rules, like we can follow the rules in school, but something happens miraculously when we start to trust in Jesus, that our nature starts to change, and that these are the characteristics we should see when our nature starts to change. And so, so I'll play this next video, and that helps them remember the fruit of the Spirit.
Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness,
So kind of fun, little juvenile songs, but because they're so catchy, they usually are helpful in helping with memorization. So let me go back. You'll see from our next agenda component is the Lord's Prayer. I have made little folders that have all of these kind of PowerPoint slides, but in a printable format so that we can go over each of them and they'll refer to them. And so I'll have them open up in in their little blue book manuals about where the Lord's Prayer is. Oh, I forgot to mention this first. So before we go through Lord's Prayer, we get to 10 Commandments. I will introduce the 10 Commandments and say that the first place we see this is in the Old Testament. In Exodus, I'll give kind of a short review of Moses and him getting the Israelites away from the Pharaoh. And now he goes up onto Mount Sinai and he gets the 10 Commandments given to him by God. I'll usually play this little video in the background, but I'll turn the volume down because I like to go through each one. So I'll say, the first one, I'm going to turn this volume down real quick, but I'll let them play. So I'll say the first one is to have no other gods. And this would be where back then they might have worshiped the god of Baal or Molech or the god of the sun. And God knows that he is the only true God. But then I'll apply it to nowadays and I'll say, we may not worship those gods now. We may worship gods like our favorite artist or celebrity or athlete or whoever it might be. And what we have to be careful of is that while it's okay to uh, um, appreciate those people, it's not okay to worship them. We have to be very careful that we're not progressing to the level of worship. So number 2 is going to be no graven images. And so we'll talk about back then, those might have been the Israelites melted down their jewelry and made a golden calf to worship. And so while we may not worship golden calves per se, there's certainly things that we might make idols, and we might point out, their shoes or their video game consoles, or as adults, we might have almost as an idol our homes or our cars or And so we have to be very careful that we're not making those into idols. Number 3 will say, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. And so one of the things we have to be careful of is I'll always say, this means not doing bad things, or not saying God's name with bad words. But it also means not doing bad things in God's name. So if people know that you are a representative of Jesus, we have to be very careful of how we carry ourselves, that we wouldn't want to say, hey, I'm collecting money for the church, and really put it in our own pocket. That would be a misuse of God's name. Another example I might use is we have a local, high school, and the children will eventually go to that high school. And so I'll say, imagine if we all wore our, school jerseys as showing support of the team, but while the team was playing a game, they were bad sports, or they were rude, or they were disrespectful. What How do you think people who saw other people wearing that jersey would think of us, knowing that that team poorly represented um, what that team means? And so essentially we're wearing a jersey representing Jesus. And so if people know that we represent Jesus, and we're rude to our teachers, or we're cheating or stealing, or whatever it might be, we are misusing God's name, and we might turn people away from him. And so we don't want to do that. So then number 4, this is the one that I say is not repeated in the New Testament. And so that is to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And so I always say that the Sabbath is a day that we want to have as rest, but really the reason it's not repeated in the New Testament is because Jesus is our rest. So it's still a good idea, just not a command. Still a good idea to have a day to come to church, and a day of worship, and a day of rest, just not as a command the same way that the others are in the New Testament. Number 5, I always say we're almost halfway done. Number 5 is honoring your father and your mother, that God adores and loves and understands the importance of a family. And one of the first components of an intact family is a mother and father. And as children, learning to honor our father and mother helps us to better understand the relationship of honoring our Heavenly Father. And so that's why it was so important to include in the 10 Commandments. Number 6 we get to, and I use kind of hand gestures because I want the children to start to memorize these, but I'll use like little reminders. And so for this one, I'll kind of do like a motion to my chest there, and I'll go, thou shalt not commit murder. And this is where I clarify that truly the Hebrew word is murder and not kill. I like to say that murder is the intentional taking of an innocent human life. So intentional, innocent, and human. And then I'll clarify this is that, if there was an accident where someone was hit by a car, that's not murder because it was not intentional. If it was a person who was threatening us, and they were, through self-defense, they were stopped and died, that would not be murder because that person would no longer be innocent. And if it was a bug that we were squishing, we wouldn't say we murdered the bug when we stepped on it, because it's not a human life, because humans are special. Humans are made in God's image. And so that's why that's an important distinction. And so we'll include that. And then moving on to number 7. This is where I say, the screen says, keep your marriage promises. I'll use, the text and saying, I always say, this is where I do my kissy face, and I'll kind of do my, hug and kiss face. But I'll say, this is where it says, you shall not commit adultery. I'll refer back and I say, you remember how I said God holds families very special. And the first component of that is that husband and wife coming together to be a strong support and strong anchor of the family. And strong families mean strong communities and strong societies. But one of the worst things that can happen to a family is a betrayal. And so really I'll say, bottom line, this means that we wouldn't want to be romantic with someone who was not our husband or wife. I try to keep it like that. Of course, there's more nuance and clarity that's needed, but that's a, a great place to start is that you shall not commit adultery means you shouldn't be romantic with someone who is not your husband or your wife. And to do that builds relationship, it builds trust, and to violate that would be such a betrayal that it would be hard to keep a family together if that were happening. So it's important enough to God to make it one of the 10 commandments. Number 8, I'll usually take something off of the desk in front of the students and I'll say, thou shalt not steal. And they very quickly understand that what I'm referencing there. I'll say, your stuff is your stuff and my stuff is my stuff. I'll say, does this mean, what does it mean if you're hungry or poor or starving? Is it okay to steal then? And they usually, most of them know, no, it's not okay to steal. And I said, now, could God forgive us if we make a wrong choice when we are hungry or starving or poor? And they'll go, of course. And, we'll talk about that. But I'll also say, here's the thing. Here's why it's so wonderful the way God has kind of designed us and encouraged us is that we're also commanded to provide voluntarily for those folks. And that's why we bring our money to the church. So that if you are hungry or in need, you don't have to steal. You can come to the church and we can help provide for you and hopefully help the circumstances that are leading you to be hungry and in need so that it's not something that you would be in need for forever, but that we can help provide that for you. And that way you don't have to steal. We have been commanded to care for those in need. And then that way you wouldn't even need to violate that command. Then we get to the 9th commandment, and I say, do not bear false witness or do not lie. What you say is what you mean, and what you mean is what you say. That one's pretty self-explanatory. I think most people kind of understand that, but we kind of sometimes clarify. This might mean sometimes in a knee-jerk reaction, we might say something that's not true because we know that's what someone wants to hear. And I'll encourage the kids if that ever happens, to go ahead and stop and say, you know what, that's not exactly true. I don't know why I said that. Here's what is true. Because at this young age, it really is quick to say what you think someone wants to hear you say, but I want to give them the courage to fix that, not kind of hang on a lie or hang on a something that they just said out of quickness, but to stop and say, you know what, that's not true. I don't know why I said that. Here's what I really meant to say. And then finally, we get to number 10, and I say, the final one is thou shalt not covet. And I usually put my hands over my eyes, kind of like binoculars, or the reason I do that is because usually coveting starts with looking. But I'll clarify that coveting is not just wanting something that somebody has. It's usually along with that strong desire where God wants us to be content with what we have. That by all means, we can see something that someone has and we can say, oh, look at those pretty shoes. I might want a pair for myself. I'll save up and I'll work on getting those shoes. But coveting is having that jealous desire in our hearts that make us start to think, she doesn't deserve those shoes. I deserve those shoes. And coveting is usually the first step to maybe stealing or, one of the other 10 commandment violations. And so coveting is wanting that specific thing, but in a way that makes us not content with what we have. So that's how I kind of cover our 10 commandments. And the more we do it, we go over it pretty quickly. They get to know it, so they don't need the full description as much. Next, we do our Apostles' Creed, our Lord's Prayer. We go over the the Sermon on the Mount. I introduced the Sermon on the Mount very quickly, Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7. And I say, do you know that Jesus literally gave us a format for how to pray? And so we'll read that together in our books. And then we'll go over the Apostles' Creed, and we'll talk about that there's not one place in the Bible that the Apostles' Creed could be found. It's not like you could flip to one book. But everything in the Apostles' Creed does have a scriptural reference. And I've got that in their little notebooks for them so they can see every line and where it came from scripture. And so then we go through that. We also, this is a good time to kind of talk about some vocabulary that the word Catholic in the Apostles' Creed means universal, not the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, we cover a little bit about kind of the different streams of Christianity versus, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant streams of Christianity. But this is a time that we talk about that word Catholic means universal. And so we go over the Apostles' Creed. By this time, usually we're getting close to the end of time for our Sunday school. And so I do a brief kind of quick look at our Cold Case Christianity book and introduce some of our characters. I show them the notebook, and so I'll save that for another video where I'll talk about what I teach in the second class. But by then, they're usually got some conversation things they want to add. They've got some questions they want to ask. And so this is a great place to start. Like I said, it's a little bit of a time commitment at the beginning, but you've got to kind of bring your new students up to speed. And then every subsequent class goes much quicker after you do your brief introduction. So that's where I start with our first class of the year. I usually start that last Sunday of August. We call that our promotion Sunday. We also gift our fifth graders a Bible. A couple of years ago, I suggested that we start with a picture Bible because in middle school or high school, when they graduate, they usually will get a Word Bible, some type of either study Bible. And so I think it's so great to have a picture Bible version to really help them make sense of the stories. I always remind them and reiterate that the picture Bible is not a replacement for their worded Bible, their study Bible, but it's just a great way to help some of the concepts come to life so that it makes more sense when they're reading their actual worded Bible. And by that time, we are pretty much done. I have a little Facebook page that I kind of keep the parents up to date with, and then a little QR code that the parents can scan to follow the Facebook page just so they can keep up with the updates. I also, you've been following for any amount of time, about our Practical Tactical Faith website. And so I've got a little code there. That's where all the slides that we go over in their blue books are also housed, just so parents can follow along in case they have any questions too. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, or you can check out the website too and just see the slides that are there. But that's how we do our first day back of Casemakers Academy. Thanks so much. Bye.